In the American South, where power was treated as sacred and those who held it were always right, and where human beings were regarded as property, meaning they were considered personal assets, truth sometimes surfaced from places no one expected. In the year 1839, on a large plantation in Alabama, something was happening that could not remain hidden forever. Two young women, twin sisters who had shared everything since birth, their faces, their wealth, their family name, now, without anyone openly saying it, shared another secret between them. Both were pregnant. They had no husbands, no engagements, and no explanations society was willing to accept. Yet the answer lived in the same house, not at the dining table, not among guests, but in the silence of corridors and behind closed doors. A man whom the law did not recognize as human, yet whose existence bound the fate of two families together. This story is not about love, it is not about scandal. This story is about absolute power and the price that is always paid by those with the least of it. After their father's death, the plantation entered a period that appeared ordinary on the surface, yet nothing was truly in its proper place, because authority that had belonged to one man for years had now passed to two young women. Women society did not believe capable of carrying such a burden alone, and that judgment weighed heavily on them. If you've been inspired by this story and want to hear more stories like it, like the video right now, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. From this point on, the narrative moves into a deeper layer, gradually revealing how this newly acquired power was released without restraint. Carolyn and Catherine, who had always lived in their father's shadow, were now the final decision-makers, not only over land and crops, but over the lives of people on the plantation who had no right to choose. Social pressure to marry began within the first months, yet neither was willing to trade her independence for a man who expected obedience, and this refusal drove them further into their own closed world. The large house slowly emptied of gatherings and visitors, and a silence settled in, broken only by footsteps echoing through the hallways. Within this confined space, Isaac's role grew more prominent, a man enslaved since birth on the same plantation, literate, and because of that literacy allowed into parts of the house forbidden to others. He carried letters, kept accounts in order, and moved constantly from room to room, and this constant proximity made his presence seem normal, more normal than it ever should have been. Requests were simple at first, then time-consuming, then they extended into the night, and each time Isaac obeyed, knowing well the consequences of refusal. Among the other enslaved people, glances changed, silences grew heavier, and everyone understood that some things must not be seen or heard. The privileges Isaac had set him apart from the others, yet that separation carried a cost, paid in fear and emotional erosion. Nights grew longer. Hallways witnessed movements no one spoke of, and the sisters, without ever naming it aloud, entered a dangerous game they believed they could always control. This part reaches a moment where nothing has yet become public, but all the signs are gathering, signs that will soon be impossible to ignore, and once they are finally seen, there will be no turning back. And when they are finally seen, there will be no return. Days passed quietly, with nothing outwardly happening, yet that very absence of events was the most dangerous element, because everything was drifting toward normalcy, a normalcy that should never have existed. Carolyn and Catherine each handled this power differently, one through order and control, the other through restlessness and impulse, yet the result was the same, the use of authority the law granted them without condition. In the midst of it all, Isaac had no name worth mentioning, no voice worth hearing, only a presence that was required and a body that was available, and this namelessness made him more vulnerable than ever. Each night he returned to his room. Exhaustion was not only in his body, but in his eyes, in his silence, and in the distance that had grown between him and everyone else. The other enslaved people tried to act normally, brief jokes, everyday talk, but all of them knew something was wearing him down that could not be stopped. The summer heat grew heavier, the air more suffocating, and bodies reacted faster than minds, with small but undeniable signs slowly accumulating. Neither of the sisters was yet willing to face reality, because to look at it meant admitting that the control they believed they had was nothing more than an illusion. They retreated into silence, into the outward order of the house, into schedules that on paper made everything appear organized, while truth was growing in places that could not be planned. The more Isaac stood at the center of this silence, the more he understood that no future had been imagined for him, neither in this house nor beyond it, and that absence of a future was the heaviest weight of his captivity. This episode ends at the moment when everything is still hidden, yet so close to the surface that collapse is only a matter of time.
After the signs began revealing themselves one by one, the plantation entered a phase in which even silence could no longer pretend that everything was normal, because every day, every hour, and even every glance carried the weight of anticipation and fear. Caroline and Catherine could no longer blame the changes merely on exhaustion or the summer heat, because their bodies were exposing a truth the mind refused to accept. Each woman tried in her own way to preserve the outward order of life, one by tightening control over work and details, the other by retreating into isolation and withdrawing from everyone. Yet these efforts resembled escape more than control, and the longer they continued, the clearer their failure became. Inside the house, the female servants were the first to sense that something beyond rumor was unfolding. Glances lingered longer. Whispers grew quieter and more cautious, because everyone understood that knowing too much could be dangerous and even life-threatening. Isaac, meanwhile, was under greater pressure than ever, because each sign that surfaced pulled him closer to the center of a danger from which there was no escape and for which no one was willing to step forward on his behalf. He continued performing his usual duties, carrying letters, organizing accounts, moving between rooms, yet each step now felt heavier, as if the ground beneath him had lost its former solidity. Without speaking to one another, the sisters entered a shared state of fear, a fear born from the realization that if the truth were revealed, no solution would exist without sacrifice. The same society that had granted them power was the society that would mercilessly destroy them in the event of scandal, and this contradiction followed them like a constant shadow. Their first response was deeper concealment, looser clothing, withdrawal from gatherings, repeated excuses for avoiding ceremonies and visits. But these solutions were temporary, because bodies could not be hidden forever, and time was an enemy that advanced steadily. Psychological pressure made the atmosphere of the house suffocating. Even ordinary sounds became irritating, and every simple interaction risked turning into an unspoken tension. Isaac felt the gazes toward him had changed, not only those of the other enslaved people, but also those of the house's owners, gazes that were now colder and more calculating, as if he were no longer seen as a human being, but as a problem whose existence created danger. He understood well that in such circumstances, the weakest piece is always the first to be sacrificed, a piece whose removal could restore calm for others. At the same time, rumors slowly crossed the boundaries of the plantation and reached neighboring ears, vague yet unsettling rumors about two young women who were rarely seen in society and whose behavior had grown unusual. Each rumor was like a small blade sinking quietly, deepening the anxiety. The sisters were forced to think about the future, a future in which they would have to offer an explanation that society might accept, and that thought pushed them toward paths they had never imagined before. Isaac increasingly felt that his presence was no longer merely part of the household's order, but a danger that would sooner or later have to be confronted. Nights grew longer and heavier, silences deeper, and every thought of tomorrow brought fresh anxiety. At times, alone with himself, he wondered whether leaving this place would change anything, yet he knew even such a thought could make his fate worse. The sisters, too, wrestled with their fears in silence, one clinging to order and calculations, the other pacing endlessly in restless unease, yet both had reached the same realization: this situation could not continue as it was. The plantation grew heavier with each passing day, as if the air itself had conspired with its inhabitants to increase the pressure. Mornings began later, and nights arrived sooner, and this shift in time disrupted everyone's sense of balance. Caroline tried to suppress the inner chaos by enforcing stricter discipline, issuing more precise orders, treating minor mistakes as major faults, while Catherine chose another path, spending most of her time in her room, drawing the curtains and avoiding confrontation, as if distance from watchful eyes could also keep truth at bay. This difference in behavior created a silent rift between the sisters, a rift not yet spoken aloud, but clearly felt. Amid these tensions, Isaac became more cautious than ever with every movement and every word, knowing the smallest misstep could lead to consequences beyond repair. He carried out his duties with obsessive precision, not out of devotion, but out of a deep fear that had taken root within him. Among the other enslaved people, behavior grew more guarded, jokes rarer, laughter shorter, glances more questioning, because everyone sensed that something was approaching that might involve them all. The female servants were under the greatest strain, for they saw more closely, heard more, and were forced to pretend they knew nothing. Each time one passed the sisters, her heart sank, uncertain which look might signal danger. Isaac often lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, thinking about how his life had reached a point where no future could be imagined, no freedom to hope for, not even security to rely on. He knew his fate was tied to decisions others would make, decisions that might never even speak his name. The sisters, in their own silences, struggled with their fears, one worrying about preserving appearances, the other haunted by the certainty that everything would eventually collapse. Days passed, and rumors slowly took clearer shape, not clear enough to be denied, yet not explicit enough for anyone to claim responsibility for spreading them. This uncertainty exhausted everyone, a fatigue not only of the body, but of the mind. The plantation became a place where everyone played their role, yet no one believed in the story that was taking shape. Isaac felt that with each passing day, his position grew more precarious, not because of anything he had done, but because of the truth his existence represented. The sisters, too, came to understand that silence was no longer enough, yet they still lacked the courage to face the consequences of breaking it. Everything remained suspended in a heavy tension, a tension that could collapse at any moment, with a small incident, a mistaken glance, or a rumor spoken just a little too loudly, pushing the lives of everyone on the plantation into a phase for which none of them were prepared. As time passed, fear shifted from something vague and suspended into something tangible, something that could be felt in prolonged pauses, in glances quickly stolen away, and in breaths that grew rapid for no clear reason. Caroline and Catherine were no longer facing mere signs, but consequences, consequences that slowly closed off every route of escape and forced them to contemplate decisions that would have seemed unthinkable only months earlier. Both knew that the society beyond the plantation had little patience or understanding, and that if the truth were exposed without restraint, it would not only destroy their reputation, but burn to the ground the future they had painstakingly built. That awareness intensified the pressure from within and pushed them towards solutions shaped by fear rather than justice. Meanwhile, Isaac felt more than ever that he was approaching a dangerous threshold. He noticed the changes not only in the sisters' behavior, but in the way they looked at him, in the silences that followed his presence, and in brief questions that seemed insignificant yet carried the scent of calculation. He understood that when those in power began weighing their options, the one with the least agency was usually the first to pay the price. Each time he passed through the house, it felt as though the walls were closing in on him, as if the space itself had decided to take part in the pressure. Caroline sought refuge in order, in writing lists, reviewing accounts, and issuing instructions that had to be followed precisely. She believed that if everything stayed in its proper place, perhaps the inner chaos could be restrained as well. Yet the more she tried, the clearer the failure of that approach became, because truth did not submit to ledgers or calculations. Catherine, however, moved along a different path, spending more time alone, walking, thinking, and at times becoming angry without clear cause. In her silence, she had reached the conclusion that sooner or later someone would have to be named at fault, someone on whose shoulders the entire burden could be placed so that the rest might be spared. That thought, like a seed, slowly took root in both of their minds. No name had yet been spoken aloud, but each of them knew the options were limited and that time was working against them. Under such conditions, truth was no longer a moral concept, it had become a threat that needed to be contained. Sensing the shift in atmosphere, Isaac tried to make himself less visible, to speak less, even to alter his routes through the house, but such caution offered no guarantee. In a society where the law regarded human beings as property, the caution of an enslaved man could not stand in the way of a master's decision. Among the other enslaved people, whispers took clearer form. Everyone knew something was coming, yet no one knew who would become the sacrifice. Fear cooled relationships, and trust became a scarce commodity. Some tried to distance themselves from Isaac so that if disaster struck, their names would not be drawn into it, and that distance only deepened his isolation. At night, when silence settled over the plantation, Isaac lay awake in the darkness thinking about how easily his fate could be written without his presence or consent. External pressure gradually increased as well. Neighbors' looks, seemingly friendly questions, and invitations that arrived less often were all signs that society had begun to sense something. Caroline and Catherine understood that if they did not act first, the story would be told in a way they could not control. That awareness sharpened their decisions and made them more ruthless. They were no longer concerned solely with preserving appearances, but with saving themselves, even if that salvation came at the cost of another's destruction. In the solitude of night, each of them separately reached the same conclusion. If the truth was to be revealed, it had to be shaped in a way that caused them the least harm. The conclusion was heavy and dangerous, yet in their minds it seemed rational. Isaac, unaware of these inner conflicts, saw only the signs and felt the weight of an uncertain future pressing on his shoulders. He knew he had no real choice, but he still clung to the hope that there might be a way for this crisis to subside without him being sacrificed. Yet the atmosphere of the plantation told a different story. With every passing hour, decisions took clearer shape and fear replaced hesitation. Everything was moving toward a point from which there would be no return, a point where power would decide who would be heard and who would be silenced. Isaac stood on the threshold of that point, unaware that the next step taken by others could determine his fate forever.
Decisions were no longer confined to speculation or uncertainty, and were slowly emerging from the heart of silence, not as clear statements, but as calculated behaviors and subtle changes whose direction could be recognized by anyone who paid close attention. Both Caroline and Catherine had reached the same conclusion. Time was no longer on their side, and every day of delay increased the risk of losing control. The society breathing beyond the plantation could destroy as quickly as it judged, and this awareness loomed behind every thought like a heavy shadow. Caroline tried to build a framework in which everything could be explained, a structured narrative capable of extending the order of the house outward. Yet the more she drew the lines of that narrative, the more tangled the knots became. Catherine, by contrast, thought less about constructing and more about removing, about which element could be taken out of the picture so that the rest might remain intact. This difference in perspective created a silent rift between them, one that had not yet reached conversation but already shaped their decisions. Meanwhile, Isaac was more exposed than ever to looks whose meanings had shifted. He was no longer merely part of the daily order, but had become the point toward which every thought of the future inevitably led. Each time his name passed through one of the sisters' minds, it carried with it an image of both danger and solution, and that combination made him increasingly unsafe. Isaac sensed the change not through spoken words, but through silences that stretched longer, and through instructions that had grown more precise and restrictive. He tried to make himself smaller, to be seen less, yet in an atmosphere where eyes searched for a culprit, even becoming smaller could be read as a sign. The household servants noticed that a new order was taking shape. Movements were more controlled, conversations shorter, and glances more cautious. Everyone understood that a mistake at such a moment could carry a cost beyond repair. Rumors that had once been vague now took clearer form, not clear enough to dismiss, but too distinct to ignore. Neighbors reminded their presence with smiles that lingered too long and questions that were overly curious. This external pressure pushed decisions toward severity and convinced both sisters that if a blow was to be struck, it would be better for them to determine its timing and direction. Caroline began gathering signs, aligning timelines, reviewing movements, and searching for a narrative she could deliver with confidence if necessary.
She thought about the law, about what could be said and what could be concealed, about the lines that, if drawn correctly, might prevent disaster. Catherine focused instead on immediate consequences, on what society would hear and what it would accept, and she understood well the role fear plays in shaping belief. She knew stories built on fear are believed more quickly and questioned less. Isaac, unaware of the details of these calculations, felt only the weight of the atmosphere. His sleep grew lighter at night and his movements more cautious by day. He remembered how the law spoke of people like him, how it erased names and left only ownership behind. That knowledge made every small hope fragile. He knew that if a story were constructed, his voice would have no place within it, and that inequality turned fear into something deeper than terror. On the plantation, relationships grew colder. Those who once worked side by side now kept their distance, careful not to have their names tied to any corner of the unfolding events. Trust, always scarce, had nearly vanished. Each person sought a safer path for themselves, even if that path passed by another and left them alone. This isolation placed Isaac even more squarely at the center of danger, because solitude makes a person easier to target. Time moved relentlessly forward, and with each passing day the urgency of decision grew stronger. Caroline and Catherine were both approaching a point beyond which retreat was no longer possible. Their perspectives still differed, but their destination was the same: self-preservation in the face of a merciless society. Along this path, morality gave way to survival, and narrative became more important than truth. Both understood that once a narrative took shape, truth would have no chance to compete. In the silence of night, when the lights were extinguished and the house seemed to hold its breath, this awareness settled on their shoulders like a shared weight. Isaac, too, felt in that same silence the presence of something inevitable, something he could neither name nor escape. Everything was moving toward a moment when words would give way to action and decisions would leave the mind to shape destinies, a moment in which power would once again reveal how quietly it could choose who would remain and who would be erased.
The day of the trial did not begin with noise. It began with a silence heavier than any shout. The courtroom was filled with people who had come not to discover the truth, but to witness a scandal they had already judged. Eyes were fixed on the entrance, waiting not for justice, but for spectacle. When Isaac entered, before anyone questioned him, he stepped forward himself. His voice was neither trembling nor defiant. Direct and brief, he said he would tell everything. He moved first, before narratives could be constructed. He confessed to the relationships, to the nights, to the coercion that had no name. For a moment the room froze, but the stillness was not shock, it was the shared knowledge of the law. Everyone knew that the testimony of an enslaved man against white citizens carried no legal weight on paper. The judge knew it, the sisters' lawyers knew it. Isaac's confession was recorded, not because it mattered, but because it could be set aside. The twin sisters sat apart. Caroline, composed, organized her notes, while Catherine, her gaze shifting between the floor and the crowd, struggled to steady herself. When their turn came, the narratives began, precise, carefully chosen, and legally sound. Yet what drove the trial forward was not Isaac's confession, it was the evidence. The timelines of the pregnancies were presented, dates aligned, intervals calculated. Then the personal journals were produced, private writings, notes never meant to be seen. Letters were examined, not read aloud, but clear enough that no one could pretend ignorance. Truth, unlike the law, found its way through. The trial reached a point where denial was no longer possible, only management. The judge sought balance, not justice, but order. The sentences were announced one by one. For Isaac, there was no prison and no formal execution. The order was sail to the deep south. Everyone knew what that meant: total separation, labor to exhaustion, a death that arrived slowly and unseen. The sentence was spoken in legal terms, but its impact was human: erasure. For the sisters, the judgment took another form.
Heavy financial penalties were imposed. The plantation was confiscated. Their names were struck from social registers. Invitations ceased. Doors closed. There was no imprisonment. Their bodies remained free, but their identities collapsed. Society neither embraced them nor formally punished them. It cast them aside, to a place where one is visible but never accepted. Then came the fate of the children, infants not yet born, yet already sentenced. Both were identified as mixed race. The decision was swift and devoid of emotion: enslavement. Their true identities were concealed, names were changed. The official story became something else entirely. Children who could have embodied the truth were absorbed into the very system that buried it. When the trial ended, the crowd dispersed, some satisfied, some curious, some feeling the triumph of restored order. The plantation was sold, the house emptied, and lives moved on to separate paths. Isaac was never seen again. Only a name remained in the records. The sisters were each pushed to the margins, neither together nor central. The children grew up without knowing what had been hidden from them. Years passed, society changed, laws evolved, and things once forbidden became speakable. New evidence emerged: genetic testing, family records, connections drawn across generations. It became clear that the lineage had continued. A truth that arrived late but had never truly been absent. Names may have changed, but blood followed its own course. What the law refused to accept, time slowly proved. This is how the story ended, not with the triumph of justice, but with the persistence of truth. Power did its work, but it could not erase everything. Some things arrive late, but when they do, they can no longer be ignored.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this video. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel now, like the video, and share your thoughts with us in the comments.